Hello, all of you. Thanks so much for staying with us. This is such a pleasure to be working with Casa Árabe. I am representation of Fundación Alternativas, and particularly with such an amazing lineup of experts. This is a true honor, a genuine honor. Now we are going to start with the second session, which is entitled Regions in Transformation, Adjusting to New Social, Economic, and Political Realities. Our speakers are going to be, again, such an honor to have that kind of experts. Luciano, Zaccara, Yasmina, Abouzzohour, Youssef, Cherif, and wrapping up with the difficult task of summarizing all of the insights and all of the information we're having, Haizam, Amirah-Fernández. Afterwards, we are going to have two honorary speakers for the closing remarks. We are also looking forward to that because it is also an honor to have both of them with us, Ambassador James Moran and Jackie Al-Zubir. So this seminar, the starting point, confirmed by the first session's brilliant interventions and debates, is that it is increasingly essential to examine the Mediterranean context through a wider scope that encompasses regional dynamics in the Middle East and Africa, as well as global shifts. The Gulf presence in the region, we've seen that is not new, it's nothing new throughout the decades, but it has changed as of lately, and it has sometimes grown, and it has particularly become more complex. Our goal is to understand precisely through the prism of Gulf engagement in the Mediterranean a number of converging dynamics, mainly geopolitical competition and regional conflicts, but also domestic politics and political dynamics, and potential avenues, hopefully, for cooperation. This session aims to look into the current development of the Gulf countries' multidimensional strategies in and towards the Maghreb, as well as their consequences. As we have seen with the case of Libya, a distinct setting in this regard is represented by context of conflict. Additionally, we intend to look into the political arenas of Maghreb countries, which have also witnessed variable geometry interventions by Gulf Arab countries, oftentimes mirroring the Gulf's own fault lines. The engagement is also ideational, ideological. As Frederick said, it is about a model state. And let's not forget that we are talking about republics, but also about monarchies, and also about the importance of both individuals and elites. The Gulf Cooperation Council internal dynamics, particularly after the 2017 blockade of Qatar, have had repercussions throughout the whole so-called MENA region and beyond. Will these impacts change, for example, as a consequence of the flow symbolized by the Al-Ula summit? Speaking of recent moves from the Gulf, what will be the impact of the so-called Abraham Accords as the normalization with Israel that Patty have mentioned? Other dimensions could also take on a renewed significance. I am thinking of political economy, and I'm so happy that Cynthia spoke about infrastructure, particularly in a post-pandemic scenario, and particularly taking into account this renewed centrality of the Mediterranean for global trade and new or reconfigured value chains. I'm thinking also about soft power and its different dimensions. I'm thinking about the role of non-Arab powers in areas of common interest to both the Maghreb and the Arab Gulf. Fatih has pointed some of them from Turkey to China, passing through Russia. The resulting analysis might shed some light, hopefully, on the shifting stances of Maghreb and Gulf states in the face of new points of contention, and again, hopefully, new points of convergence. First, we have with us Luciano Zaccara. He's a research assistant professor in Gulf politics at the Qatar University Gulf Studies Center and the director of the Observatory on Politics and Elections in the Arab and Muslim world in Spain. He has been assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, a visiting research scholar at the Center for Iranian Studies at Princeton University, and visiting researcher at the University of Exeter. He holds a PhD in Arab and Islamic Studies from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. He specializes in Gulf and Iranian politics and foreign policy, elections and political reform in Gulf Cooperation Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and international politics in the Persian Gulf. Afterwards, we are going to speak, as Irene was hoping, about Maghrebi domestic politics, but I think with Luciano, we are maybe going to be focusing on the Gulf once more. Luciano, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Itxaso and Karim, for inviting me to join this wonderful panel. The bar is too high now after the first panel. And as you say, I mean, I'm not an expert in the Maghreb, so I will focus more on the GCC and the challenges that the GCC, I think they are facing and will face, and they have been facing since the Arab Spring until now, and that which challenges that also forced the GCC government to take specific measures that at the end of the day created some of the problems we are witnessing in the Maghreb and in different regions of Africa, as we listened or heard in the first panel. I assume that we all agree on the fact that the GCC states were not immune to the Arab Spring. I mean, what the Arab Spring demonstrated is the GCC states, I mean, the 6 monarchies in the GCC state were not immune to the revolts, and that all the GCC governments were forced to use a combination of different strategies to guarantee the survival and the resilience of the political regimes and the elites in power. These 4 strategies were redistributive policies or economic reforms, limited political or institutional reform, reinforcement of the internal security frameworks, and reorientation of the foreign policy. I'm not going to detail them, but of course, it was possible to implement redistributive policies, increasing salaries of nationals, creating jobs in public sector, raising worker wages and benefits, implementing the national visions, because of the economy was not severely affected due to the Arab Spring. On the other hand, however, discussions about taxation, economic diversification, and nationalization of working labor force started to be debated in all the GCC states. We had also limited political reforms with elections, some institutional changes in elected chambers, changes in citizenship law and residency permits. In the third strategy, reinforcements of internal security, many laws about anti-terrorism, cybercrime, designation of terrorist group, as was mentioned before, the dissolution of parties, etc., took place. And for the reorientation of the foreign policy, which I think it was what we were discussing in the first panel, how the impact of the Arab Spring forced, to some extent, the GCC states to take different orientation in foreign policy to address their main security concerns, and also to build up on the leverage that they were having already in some areas, but they tried to be maximized through active or more proactive foreign policy in Arab Spring or post-Arab Spring scenarios, like Yemen, Syria, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, for instance. We all know that after this very proactive implementation of foreign policy in the GCC, several crises took place in the region. In 2014, we had the first diplomatic crisis within the GCC context, between Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Emirates, and Qatar. And the second chapter of this rift was the blockade that started in 2017 and lasted until recently, until December. So the impact of the Arab Spring drove or triggered more proactive foreign policy in post-Arab Spring scenarios that included most of the Arab world and also the Horn of Africa. What happened now that since 2020 we have another big crisis, again, an external event that is affecting the GCC states, which is the COVID pandemic, that is forcing also again all the GCC states to implement a combination of these 4 strategies that I mentioned before: redistributive policies, limited political reform, reinforcements of the internal security frameworks, and reorientation of the foreign policy. The problem is, while the first crisis was not very harmful in economic terms, the second one, it is very very harmful in economic terms. The main measures took in 2020 and 2021, they are focused on economic measures to tackle the negative effects of both the fall of the oil prices and export and reduction of the domestic economies, while in the Arab Spring, the salaries and wages were raised. In this case, subsidies started to be cut, taxation started to be implemented in a very shy way, but there is a lot of debate about that, reducing benefits to national and non-national workers, more protectionist national labor national labor force, restriction of movements, restriction of migration policies. So all these measures taken by the GCC states are to some extent diminishing the capacity or the external capacity that the GCC state had after the Arab Spring in terms of foreign policy. I mean, according to my perception, there is no doubt that while after the Arab Spring, the GCC state found in the reorientation or the more proactive foreign policy a tool to gain more leverage and to regain legitimacy regionally and internationally through exporting their influence all over the Arab and Muslim world and African world. Now the economic constraints are forcing all the GCC states to focus on sustaining their own economies, sustaining their own economic and political models. We have to bear in mind that the GCC states are still very oil-dependent economies, despite the fact of diversification policies or any other vision that started to be implemented. I mean, still the oil dependency is very high in all the GCC states. That they are models that they are very migrant dependent, with Qatar and UAE having around 85% of non-national working force, less if we compare with the Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. That they were, I mean, at least 2 or 3 of them, they were using or they were implementing the transportation hubs models through Qatar Airways, Emirates, and Etihad, and of course this crisis is affecting them as well, and that they have some issues with food security, all of them, even though they managed to survive. Here in Qatar, also the blockade contributed to increase this kind of challenges as a result of the blockade that was imposed by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Emirates. So what I'm trying to say and to summarize a little bit about my ideas in this parliament, I don't want to discuss things that they were mentioned before. I think they were brilliantly discussed by the 3 previous speakers, is that while the Arab Spring did not represent a serious challenge for the GCC states in terms of foreign policy, actually it represented an opportunity to extend their power and to occupy the vacuum of power produced in most of the GCC post-Arab Spring scenarios. The COVID-19 contributed to reduce the scope of the range of the GCC countries' foreign policy, because of the restrictions that the economy or the economic grievances are imposed to these GCC countries. There are much more. I mean, if we go back to these 4 strategies that they mentioned before, we will, I think, witness more changes or more measures taken in the second area, which is the limited political reform, in order to tackle the effects of the COVID, rather than the redistributive policies, the reinforcement of internal security, and the reorientation of the foreign policy. Why? Because while the redistributive policies were not able to be implemented because of the economic constraints, more demands or more concerns have been or are being raised by nationals in all of the GCC states. We have been witnessing how social network platforms like Clubhouse became form of discussion in most of the GCC states, and how this is making the debate to be politicized. However you understand politics, we have a lot of discussion about what is to be interested in politics and what is to be interested in internal politics. But on the other hand, we can see that to some extent, this represents demands to the governments about what the governments are doing or how the GCC governments are tackling the effects, the economic effects of this pandemic in the GCC, which at the end of the day represent also a concern for most of the local population here in the GCC. Just to mention two of these limited political reforms or impacts on the political or institutional frameworks, that we had elections in Kuwait recently in December. And I mean, there are many things we can say about what happened in Kuwait, but you can hear in all the GCC states, in the rest of the GCC states, is that we don't want to follow the Kuwaiti model. Nobody wants to reproduce what is happening in Kuwait, which is this confrontation or permanent confrontation between the emir or the political power and an elected National Assembly. But recently, the National Assembly, we can say that it's mainly occupied by members of the opposition, which also can bring more political debate to the whole region. And last but not least, we are going to have for the first time in Qatar in October legislative elections, and the debate already started, even though we don't have enough information to discuss about it and do research about that. But this means that people or Qataris, mainly young Qataris, started to debate about what is expected from this. If this had happened after the Arab Spring, it would have been absolutely different. Now, the kind of debate we are witnessing, we can say is much more economic or politically oriented rather than more internationally oriented as it was after the Arab Spring. With this, I'm going to stop. So I'll leave the floor for other colleagues, and I'm waiting for your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Luciano. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed how you went from this idea of guaranteeing the survival of regimes after the so-called Arab Spring in terms of ideology, in terms of security, but it went much beyond, and that's what we've seen in the first session, how all of these Gulf Arab countries have intervened or are engaged with North African or with the whole of the Mediterranean in different dimensions, the political economy and others. But guaranteeing the survival of regimes after the COVID, particularly taking into account the impact of the pandemic, is going to be even much harder when you talk about sustainability, and this is going to be key when we look at the Arab Gulf states, but also when we look at some Maghreb states. That's, for example, I'm thinking of Algeria and how it is going to diversify, how it is going to be able to diversify their economy. I'm thinking of Tunisia. I'm thinking of Libya, of course, and its reconstruction, and who is going to help reconstructing the country. And I'm even thinking about Morocco. And speaking of Morocco, we have with us the second panelist. She's Yasmina Abouzzohour. She's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center and the European Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior fellow at the Moroccan Institute for Policy Analysis. Her research revolves around authoritarian persistence and transition, focusing on regime strategic, economic, and political behavior and their interactions with opposition movements, with a particular focus on monarchical survival and behavior. We spoke about monarchical survival, and this is going to be maybe one of the threads we could pursue in the debate. Geography-wise, Yasmina's research touches on both the Maghreb and the Gulf regions. Received her PhD in politics from the University of Oxford, and she's going to also share with us a presentation. And I'm really looking forward to listening to your speaking. Yasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to wait for you to load the presentation. But thank you in the meantime for having me, and thank you to my fellow presenters for their valuable contributions. It's a rudimentary presentation, but I hope you can follow. So I can't see if it's on or not. Maybe you can help me with that. Oh, there it is. Great. Perfect. So I'm going to speak briefly about Maghreb Gulf relations today and then about Morocco in detail. So just moving on to the second slide, please. Thank you. So as it was mentioned earlier, relations between the Maghreb and the Gulf have gone through several ups and downs over the last decade. And I'm choosing to look at them since the Arab Spring because I think that's when the most developments happened, and then looking through to the breakthrough in Al-Ula between the Gulf states. But the 2011 uprisings deepened the Gulf countries' interest in the Maghreb. They represented a threat to the monarchies on domestic and regional levels, and countries like Saudi Arabia sought to intensify their relationship with Maghreb states, first because they aimed to counter the perceived rising Iranian influence in the region, and then because they wanted to avoid the rise of further Islamist leadership in North Africa after Al-Nahda had come to power in Tunisia and the Muslim Brotherhood had done so in Egypt. And finally, in the aftermath of the uprisings, the GCC states, and this was mentioned earlier, are all monarchies and they aim to form a sort of loose monarchical alliance. We're not quite sure why at this point, but most likely to counter the growing republicanism in the broader region. And so this explains, of course, the membership invitation extension to Morocco and Jordan, as well as importantly, the $5 billion in aid pledged to each one of them. And yet, despite these strengthened ties, the last decade has seen rising tensions, especially since the Gulf crisis. These are probably linked to divergences in terms of foreign policy orientation and political ideology. However, they did rise, especially with Morocco, after the Maghreb states' neutral stance during the Gulf crisis. And when Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt imposed the blockades, all these states were faced with pressures to pick a side, though unofficially, and they chose to strike a delicate balance between preserving ties with Doha without alienating the Saudi Emirati bloc. And none felt this issue more than Morocco, which I was asked to talk about today, which more importantly is arguably the Maghreb state closest to the Gulf in terms of economic, diplomatic, and leadership ties. So this talk today will focus on the evolving relationship between Rabat and the Gulf. We'll examine the sporadic tensions faced in recent years, and we'll discuss a post-Al-Ula and post-COVID-19 outlook. So just the next slide, please. Thank you. We know that Morocco maintains a close relationship with the Gulf, as we discussed earlier, and this intensified since 2011. While the Gulf states' desire to deepen ties was motivated by the regional geopolitical considerations I just mentioned, Moroccan decision makers were motivated by the kingdom's economic and diplomatic policy interests. In terms of economic interests, Morocco benefits greatly from Gulf investment, aid, trade. And I alluded to this earlier. In 2011, the GCC pledged $5 billion in aid to Morocco to fund development projects. So far, mainly Qatar has come through, according to Moroccan policymakers, but we don't have enough data to see whether Saudi Arabia and the UAE sent through the aid. And still, Saudi Arabia takes the lead in terms of most aid promised and delivered overall since 2011. In fact, in 2016, Saudi Arabia signed a deal worth $230 million in aid to Morocco. There's little discussion of major aid deals right now, but that's largely due to the implications of decreased oil prices as well as the coronavirus pandemic. And as we know, GCC states also invest heavily in the kingdom, and according to the latest data we have from 2019, close to 40% of Morocco's foreign direct investment came from the Gulf, and a significant portion of this investment is calculated to go to real estate, with the UAE coming out on top, as well as hotel businesses, with major deals struck with Kuwait. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia recently pledged to invest $22 billion in Morocco's military, and here it is worth remembering that Morocco has provided security training and military support to the Gulf on several occasions in the past under both monarchs. Finally, its relationship with the GCC monarchies boosted Morocco's foreign policy. Predictably, in terms of diplomatic interests, this has much to do with the disputed territory of Western Sahara, and Gulf states have been more forthcoming and vocal than others in supporting Morocco's claim, especially after the recent partial normalization with Israel. Also importantly, however, when looking at the broader picture, This relationship has allowed Morocco to diversify its alliance base away from Europe and to become less dependent on EU influence and support. This, of course, goes hand in hand with Rabat's reorientation towards Africa over the last 5 years, as well as its move towards less traditional partners such as China, and there has been talk about a partnership with Russia. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these tensions were mostly manifested through pulling out ambassadors on both sides, refusing to meet with officials, again on both sides, and hostile rhetoric via social media, especially from the UAE towards Morocco, and on state television, especially in Saudi Arabia. For example, documentaries airing questioning Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is a big no-no for the kingdom. Morocco eventually pulled troops from the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and overall, the growing relationships and security cooperation with Qatar has greatly angered Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. This all happened since 2017 and is generally thought to be related to the Gulf crisis. However, many experts have pointed out that there is a kind of discord at the top between the leaderships. And the relationship was much smoother under when King Salman was in power. So that's something people point to. Despite these tensions, due to recent developments, the future seems brighter. So the final slide, please. These events are ongoing or recent, and so it's hard to predict, but it would be reasonable to think that Morocco-GCC ties may become stronger, or at least that there will be fewer tensions. This is mainly because many of the issues at the root of these tensions have resolved themselves or been resolved. Although GCC states have yet to heal from the wounds of the Gulf crisis, the latter is partially resolved. It is resolved to the extent that Rabat will not have to face pressures to pick sides. The Libya dossier is seeing significant developments at the present, and the prospects of a hopefully unified country will reduce the avenue for discord between Morocco on one side and major Gulf players like the UAE and Qatar on the other, and to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia. In this dossier in particular, Morocco will likely continue to support the UN's position on Libya, to emphasize the Zaccara agreement of 2015, which was signed in Morocco, and to promote inter-Libyan dialogue and advocate against foreign interference, read from outside of the region. This approach mainly promotes Morocco's own foreign policy interests. It's removed from its ties with the Gulf. We can discuss this later in Q&A, but it strengthens its credibility as a regional mediator and its value towards Western actors. Other developments will help the relationship along, and here we're mainly talking about the Abraham Accords and Morocco-UAE ties specifically. Interestingly, something that is not discussed a lot is that this partial normalization with Israel may give Morocco back some of its Hassan II era importance in terms of mediating the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. This is a position which Moroccan decision makers gradually lost over the last 2 decades, and they have been vocal about being keen to get back on it. In more immediate terms, this all translates into less tensions and less hostility. And going forward, if we wait out the pandemic and the decreased oil prices, there will likely be an increase in Gulf investment, trade, and aid packages to Morocco, especially when we consider the Gulf security interests and considerable investments in the kingdom. But for now, bilaterally, Rabat will focus its efforts on strengthening ties with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, mainly to promote its own economic and diplomatic interests. And as a side note, deepening ties with Riyadh will be viewed as a move to counter potential Algerian influence in the Gulf region. The relationship with Qatar will remain strong, and Doha will view Morocco's neutrality and slight favoritism as something to be thankful for. Moroccan decision makers continue to cast themselves as dependable allies for Qatar. And overall, despite triggering short-term tensions, which 2-3 years ago seemed almost catastrophic, Rabat's decision to maintain neutrality will pay off and is in fact doing so right now. I'm going to end here, but I'm eager to take up any of these points later in Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yasmina. It was really great. You touched upon all of the points that I mentioned. Like, I'm not going to have any questions afterwards. I will for sure. So I really enjoyed how you broke down all of the exchanges, because we could also see everything. For example, Cynthia and Fatiha were speaking about the political economy, about you spoke about real estate, but also the military. I also appreciated this idea that Morocco has been diversifying its allies, is pulling away from Europe, but still with a close link with Europe in commercial terms. Irene could speak on that regard, but looking at Africa and Africa and Morocco's African regional policy has been a model for other North African countries. Correct me if I'm wrong, for years now. It could lead to conflict. Let's hope that's not the case, but that has also strengthened links with Russia and with China. I also love it when you say that relations were smoother with King Salman. I think everything was smoother with King Salman, with his predecessor. But maybe that's going to change. And I really enjoyed how you spoke about about potential avenues for cooperation, about how Morocco could become a regional mediator. Let's hope for that. And instead of just speaking about conflictivity and contention, maybe we could speak about a shared vision for the Mediterranean and even for the rest of the African continent. And now we are going to speak about Tunisia, hopefully, or maybe other countries as well. We have with us Youssef Cherif, a friend of ours. He runs the Colombia Global Center in Tunis. He is a political analyst, member of Carnegie's Civic Activism Network, and a regular contributor to numerous think tanks specializing on North African affairs. He consulted previously, amongst others, for institutions such as the United Nations and the Casa Center. He is a former expert at the Tunisian Institute for Strategic Studies. He holds the Achievement in Masters of Art in International Relations from the Department of World Studies of King's College London, and a Fulbright Masters of Art in Classical Studies from Columbia University. Youssef, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Yes, I'll speak about Tunisia. And actually, during the last decade, Tunisia has been surfing on Gulf rivalries. The relationship between Tunisia and the Gulf states can actually be summarized in the following 5 points. 1, Tunisia is important to the Gulf states because of its proximity to Libya. 2, there is a clear media focus by the Gulf states on Tunisia, and therefore there is a full strategy that the Gulf states or the media outlets of the Gulf states are enacting towards Tunisia. And here I'm talking about Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, Al Hadaska, News Arabia, and so on. And in this strategy, I can summarize it in 2 aspects: the Emirati and the Qatar. In one aspect, the Emirati and the Qatari media demonize each other's plans in Tunisia, and they consequently delegitimize each other's allies or clients in the country. And by extension, they contribute in the political polarization in Tunisia. So the importance of Libya, the importance of Tunisia because of Libya, the media strategy. There are also some economic ties between the Gulf states and Tunisia, mostly economic investments and donations from Qatar, and donations from Saudi Arabia. So this is on the economic level. There are high-level visits between Tunisian leaders and Qatari and Saudi leaders. So again, no investments and no donations from the UAE, and no high-level visits with the UAE. And finally, the 5th point are the ongoing rumors, because I don't have confirmations, about Qatari and Emirati funding directed towards opposing political groups. So it is possible that the Qataris and the Emiratis are funding political parties in Tunisia, but I don't have proofs for this. So this summarizes the relationship and the importance of Tunisia and how for the Gulf states and how Gulf states are working in Tunisia. Now, before going country by country, I just want to specify that when we talk about Tunisia, there is a difference. There is a major difference between it and the neighboring countries, especially Yasmina was talking about Morocco. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences, not least the fact that 1, Tunisia is a democracy, and 2, Tunisia is a democracy where power is actually divided. So while in Morocco, you can talk about the vision or the strategy of the Moroccan state, In Tunisia, you have Ennahda, the largest political party in the country, that has good ties with Qatar, for instance. But that doesn't mean that the president of the republic has good ties with Qatar, and so on. Same with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, same with the Ministry of Defense. They have their own strategies and their own visions, and they do not necessarily obey to Ennahda as the largest political party in the country, and they sometimes have their own views about with whom the relationships should be better or worse. So now we go country by country, and I'll start by Qatar. Obviously, Tunisia got closer to Qatar in the last 10 years. One, because of Ennahda's proximity to Doha, which facilitated grants and loans to Tunisia. There are more than 1.5 billion grants and loans that came from Qatar to Tunisia since 2011. And two, because of Tunisia's importance for anyone active in Western Libya, and here Qatar has high interests in Western Libya. So there is a clear proximity between Tunisia and Qatar. Therefore, Qatar is the largest investor in Tunisia, the second largest foreign direct investor after France. Although we're not talking about major investments. I mean, Tunisia being the smallest North African economy, or the smallest economy between Morocco and Egypt, so the investments are not very big. But whatever is coming from Qatar is providing jobs, pumping cash in Tunisia's central bank, giving Tunisia diplomatic backing, and so on. As I said, Ennahda leaders and intellectuals have a positive view on Qatar, while in general there is a strong resentment against Qatar among any anti-Ennahda group in the country. So in the past it was among Nida Tunis constituencies. Now it is with the current opponents of Ennahda, who are always very critical of Qatar. So that's kind of a rallying point for Ennahda opponents to oppose Qatar. The relationship in the last few years, as I said, got closer, but there were ups and downs. Since the elections of 2019, Tunisia has been ruled by Ennahda as the leading party in parliament, and President Kais Saied, who is his own political figure, who doesn't have a political party, but who, according to the constitution, is the one leading the foreign affairs of the country. Clearly, Ennahda and its leader Rashid Ghannouchi went closer and wanted Tunisia to be closer to Qatar and Turkey, especially in 2019, 2020, when Turkey was fully into Libya and moving into Libya. But that the president refused it, and it actually added to the animosity or the hostility of the president towards Rashid Ghannouchi, who is the parliament speaker. And the crisis is ongoing until now. In November 2020, the president visited Qatar, and there was a clear attempt by the Qataris to co-opt him. A lot of fanfare and a lot of out of protocol privileges were given to the president. He was awarded the prize. He was given the honorary presidency of a newly created organization, and so on. But it didn't work. It didn't work that well, and his relationship with Ghannouchi deteriorated even more after he came back to Tunisia. Now, about Qatar, I would just conclude by saying that the ties between Qatar and Ennahda remain strong, and in a way, Tunisia is kind of a Qatari success story. So, and Tunisia is always seen under positive lights by Qatari media outlets. And as I said earlier, Tunisia is right next to Libya, where Qatar has a lot of interest. So as long as there is no staunch anti-Qatari regime established in Tunisia, the country will remain close to the Qatari orbit. Now, it will be shorter when I'll talk about the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But over the years, the different Tunisian leaders tried at multiple occasions to build better ties with the Saudis and the Emiratis. However, the relationship with the UAE remained cold, and Qatari, as well as pro-Ennahda media and social media outlets, often accused the UAE of attempting to destabilize Tunisia. There was not a single meeting between MBZ and a Tunisian president since 2012, at least. And the visits of Tunisian officials to the UAE have been rare, very rare, actually. There are now talks about a possible visit by President Qatar to the UAE, but it's not yet confirmed. There are often rumors about the Emiratis funding Tunisian political groups. In the past, it was about Nida Tunis, and now that period is becoming history, we see more and more Nida Tunis leaders coming out about Emirati funding, and there are now rumors about Emirati funding to a group that is fully opposed to Ennahda and openly opposed to Ennahda, and actually sometimes avoiding to criticize the UAE. But again, this is only at the level of rumors. Still, it is noticeable that the UAE never classified Ennahda as a terrorist organization, and contacts are not totally cut between Emiratis and Ennahda leaders. So there is, this is not a total dead end. To summarize about the UAE and Tunisia, I would say that the animosity between Ennahda leaders and the Emiratis seems to continue so far. It is linked to the broader Emirati campaign against political Islam, and also because the Emiratis think that Ennahda is actually playing against their interests in both Tunisia and Libya, maybe more importantly in Libya. So as long as the UAE is involved in Libya, as long as the UAE is fighting Qatari and Turkish interests in Libya and elsewhere, ties with Tunisia will continue to be bad. My last section is about Saudi Arabia, and here the relationship the relationship with Saudi Arabia is actually different from the one with Qatar and the one with the UAE. Official visits have been quite regular, especially during Haizam's time, so between 2015 and 2019, at the level of heads of state, Crown Prince from Saudi Arabia, ministers, etc., etc. But not only. Ennahda leaders, often Ennahda is portrayed as very opposed to the Saudis, but actually no. Ennahda leaders used to go quite regularly to Saudi Arabia, apart from the year 2011, and then apart from 2016 on with the rise of MBS. And actually the Ennahda leaders try as much as possible not to be critical of the Saudis. Now it depends, but you will never hear Ennahda leaders criticizing the Saudis in their war in Yemen, for instance. Also, partly in order to appease Saudi Arabia, the Tunisian leaders are very wary of any extra rapprochement with Iran. And even though the Iranians always try to build closer ties with Tunisia. So as I say, the relationship are quite good with the Saudis. I count more than $1 billion in grants and loans that came from Saudi Arabia in the last 10 years. There are many aspects of mutual visits, joint military exercises, etc., etc. Tunisians, as I said, give high importance to Saudi Arabia, one, because of the potential for economic relations and the development aid that can come from Saudi Arabia, and two, because of the importance of the Hajj for Tunisian Muslim citizens, especially now that Tunisia is now a democracy. So if Saudi Arabia stops the Hajj, that can be very bad for any Tunisian government. So for the Saudis, as long as Tunisia is not siding with Iran and not attempting to play with their internal politics, they are fine. And that's why I think Ennahda has been very cautious when dealing with Saudi Arabia. And I think the relationships will remain as they are in the upcoming years. Now, to conclude, the bickering that I mentioned between the two camps in Tunisia, especially between Qatar and the UAE, has slowed the democratic transition in the country and derailed several local and European plans for building democratic institutions and the rule of law. But as a positive conclusion, I'm trying to look into the future, and I think that the détente in the Qatar crisis may lead to changes, to positive changes. The Turks and the Qataris could feel less interested in Libya and by extension Tunisia. They also see the difficulties that their allies face in Tunisia, and therefore can become less supportive of them in the future. On the other hand, Emiratis may feel less interested in Libya and decide to be less proactive or less hostile towards Tunisia. So the two sides will attack each other's clients and allies less in the media, and that will decrease the polarization in Tunisia. And so I think we have to wait, but from what I see, the current détente in the Gulf will have positive impacts in Tunisia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Youssef. But that was brilliant. All of the sections and the breakdown also by countries that has been so enlightening. So I'm going to ask some questions to the panelists, and afterwards we will move to the Q&A by the public. So first, Luciano. So if I understood right, so you were saying that the Gulf countries the Arab Gulf countries might be thinking about downgrading their influence or the intervention in some of the countries, in the Maghreb countries and in Africa. I'm asking myself whether they can afford to do that after having invested so much in terms of infrastructure, in terms of other economic investments, and this is an open question. I understand why, but I'm not sure if this is a possibility, and maybe you have the answer. And also, because you're an expert in Iran, I was wondering whether you could shed some light, because that could also have an impact in the future on this strange event that took place in 2018. I remember I was in Iran at that time when Morocco had when all of the news were full of references to Morocco, to the rivalry between Morocco and Iran, and Morocco being about to cut relationships with Iran related to something about Hezbollah. It was not clear for me, and maybe it was clear for you. And maybe if we look into the future, and we've seen news today about Israel and Iran escalating tensions again, even if that is regular, that leads somebody to question whether that could lead to a more intense conflict, even though it hasn't happened in the past, and whether that could impact both the Gulf countries and the relationship, their foreign policies in other areas, particularly in the Mediterranean and even in the African continent. And somebody was asking in the public, and maybe you've heard that question so many times before, but I have to give it to you. What are the Gulf Cooperation Council going to do if they are faced with the same protests, uprisings, and demands that most North African countries had to face in 2011 and afterwards?
Do you want me to reply all of the questions?
You can choose. I just picked three of them for you to choose the one you're most comfortable with.
Yeah, well, I will try to address all of them. Demands, of course, there are demands, and they will be. The problem is, I don't think it will be the same nature. Now the concerns are more economic. So as far as the governments are addressing, and that's what's my point. I mean, while before they were trying to address directly the economic concern through sending money to the people, I mean, giving money, I mean, extending the social contract. I think what is now under discussion is how a social contract like this is sustainable when the resources of the state are going down. And I think this is the main challenge here, or how they can channel some of the previous benefits that they were doing in an economic way in another way, like increasing participation, increasing other kind of benefits for citizens, while they are taking some of the economic benefits. And it's already happening, and the debate is already there. If this will drive to institutionalized opposition or debate, it's something that we are going to see, at least here in Qatar in October. If it's going to drive to a more violent uprisings like it happened in Bahrain, Oman, or Kuwait, there's something that, I mean, I wish I can predict it. I mean, I didn't mean that the GCC states will reduce their interest in economic terms in the Maghreb or in the Horn of Africa or in the North of Africa. But I mean, many of you have referred about kind of financial support to political parties, to different groups to implement their own agenda in foreign policy in different scenarios of Arab Spring. I think this is going to be reduced. I mean, actually, it's happening because of different external pressures. I mean, most of the GCC states were subject to FATF. I don't remember the acronym of this international system to prevent money laundering and support to terrorism. So this, in any way, even though, again, there is no official information about how this money was transferred, to whom it was transferred, there was money transferred from most of the GCC states to different actors in post-Arab Spring scenarios. Of course, this has to be reduced because of external constraints and because there is not enough money to distribute. Of course, the priority will be given to infrastructural projects that can benefit economically the GCC states, but that they will not increase the political influence. This is my take. I'm not sure if this is going to be the end of the story or not. And regarding Iran, I mean, we can talk a lot of time about Iran. We are going to have elections in June. So far, I don't see that there's going to be any further improvement in the U.S.-Iran relations regarding the JCPOA. So I assume that until August, we will not see any big step taken by any of the two actors. And as far as this is not happening, nothing is going to change in Iran-GCC relations. We have to bear in mind that the blockade ended, and this is a huge development in Gulf politics. And the normalization with Israel also meant something, even though it didn't mean, I mean, it doesn't seem to have affected in a very drastic way Iran approach to the GCC states. So for some people in Iran, this made clear who is in one camp and who is on the other. And as far as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait are not signing, Iran will not have a different stand to any of those GCC states. And again, as far as Qatar is in one safe place in terms of mediating between Iran and the United States, as far as we know, I mean, there have been a lot of rumors about how Qatar can play a role in mediating between these two states. I think the situation is not going to change drastically in regard of Iran approach to the 6 GCC states. But again, this is a subject of long discussion.
Thanks so much, Luciano. Yasmina, your turn. I was thinking that one of the first actions of the GCC after the so-called Arab Spring was trying to inviting Morocco and Jordan, the other two monarchies of the region, into the GCC. I don't remember if it was as members, as observers. It was not clear. Nowadays, after the clear idea behind that move was, of course, guaranteeing the survival of the monarchies, seeing the republic falling one after the other. Nowadays, after the event in Jordan, I'm not sure I should be talking about coup. Maybe somebody could cast some more light on Jordan. Do you think that there is also a new that feeling of threat in terms of monarchical survival, both in Morocco or in some of the Arab Gulf countries?
Thank you. These are very interesting questions. The subject of my PhD dissertation. So if I get started, I never stop. So all of you. Well, we all thought the invitation to Morocco and Jordan to join the GCC was kind of out of the right lane because, especially Morocco, which is distant geographically speaking, but both countries are different in terms of the political system as well as, the economic system, so on and so forth. So I don't think it was a move to guarantee survival, but it was definitely a move to signal to the rest of the region this is an alliance. We have each other's backs. Of course, they didn't want any monarchy to fall because of the potential domino effect. But I think it was more of a foreign policy posturing, in my opinion. Very interesting events in Jordan, and very difficult to tell what's going on because the domestic press has a hard time covering it, and the international press is, of course, predicting and positing a lot, but the data is not available. I would not call it a coup. I would say, this was fear from, as far as I can tell, from the regime because of growing public dissidence. I think the targets were more so Basma Awadallah and other people than Prince Hamza. But of course, the focus was on the prince because of the talk of an attempted coup. But I think we can tell now that the straw that broke the camel's back was Prince Hamza talking to tribal leaders as well as families of the people who died 3 weeks ago, the COVID patients, because of oxygen shortages in Jordan's hospitals. But I think if we look at this, along with the trend in Jordan, as well as the other monarchies, the growing trend of repression, the heightened targeting of critical voices, be it through judicial proceedings, be it through campaigns criticizing these opposition actors, or be it through talks of attempted coups, I think we can see a clampdown on public opinion in general. And Jordan doesn't escape this, although it's always viewed as one of the more liberal monarchies, along with Morocco. So to answer your last question, is there a threat to monarchical survival? I always disliked the focus on monarchical survival, because if we look at the Arab Spring in general, it's, the whole monarchies versus republic dimension. Perhaps I'm the last person who should say this given my research, but it kind of misses the point, that these are authoritarian regimes of different categories who treated different levels of protests in similar ways, using similar strategies, cooptation, concession, and repression, of course. I think that we can talk about threat to the regime because, we spoke earlier about social contracts. The promises in the Arab Spring, all of them made promises of liberalization to different extents, and none of them have really kept up with them, especially the monarchies, especially. And I think these are catching up with them. I think if you look at protests in Oman in 2018, 2019, I think if you look at regular protests in Bahrain because of repression, protests in Jordan because of the economy, but also, the failure to target certain corrupt officials, and protests in Morocco that some of them were smaller scale, but also regional scale protests in the Rif, so on and so forth. I think, populations, opposition actors, interest groups it's not they're beginning to catch on, they've always caught on, it's that they're fed up with not having these promises respected by the regimes. And so it's time for these monarchies to readapt the social contract. Whether they will or not depends on whether they're motivated to do so or not. We'll see, but that's my reading of it.
Thanks so much. I so agree with the idea that they should remodel the social contract. I think we all agree with that, but the incentives to do so might be more tricky. Particularly, we take into account the structural and the obstacles that could be posed by the elites, not by the authorities themselves. And we all know how the structure of the elites work in these countries. So, Youssef, I have two questions for you. One is related to Libya. We've spoken about the Gulf rivalry and Gulf intervention in the conflict in Libya, but hopefully we are going to see a transition to peace. Inshallah, all of the inshallah in the world. But that leads me to think about reconstruction and who's going to intervene in the reconstruction. This debate is already on the table concerning Syria, and this is why so many people believe that the United Arab Emirates and other countries are pushing for Syria to be normalized and to be included in the Arab League so that they could profit from the reconstruction. Do you see similar moves, similar dynamics regarding the reconstruction of Libya? And the other question comes from the public, and I believe it is a very good question by Albert Vidal. Keeping in mind the close France, the United Arab Emirates alignment, How has France's large economic clout in Tunisia affected the way Tunisia deals with Qatar and the United Arab Emirates?
So regarding Libya, actually, the reconstruction in Libya will happen even quicker than the one in Syria, because in Libya, I mean, in Syria, you still have a lot of heavily armed extremist organizations. You still have the involvement of different countries, and it's far from over. In Libya, it's been a year of almost peacefulness, apart from a few attacks here and there, but all in all, life has kind of resumed normally. There are a lot of foreign leaders who are visiting Libya on an almost weekly basis, and the scramble for Libya has started between European countries, but also with Turkey fully in, with Egypt, and yesterday or the last 3 days, the Tunisian president was actually in Egypt. Some people say that he was there because he wanted to find some agreement with the Egyptians about what to do in Libya, but I don't think the Egyptians are interested. So there are all these countries that are now they see the market for reconstruction in Libya, and who are sending in their diplomats, their technical officers, and their companies to prospect in Libya. Actually, Tunisia could play an important role because of the neutral role it played during the Libyan war, and because of its proximity to Western Libya. But I don't know whether Western companies will be using Tunisia or not. Because it's always easier to work on Libya from Tunisia than in Libya proper, because of the transport and everything. Now, the second question is about France and the UAE, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So it didn't really. France did not put pressures on Tunisia to be closer to the UAE, but France was clearly not happy to see Turkey and Qatar becoming more and more influent in Tunisia. And this is not at all related to the UAE, because France has a much deeper relationship and connection to Tunisia than the UAE. I mean, listen to my accent. I speak almost like a Frenchman. And so that's something that is very strong in Tunisia, and it goes beyond the UAE. So there is an alliance of circumstances between the UAE and France, because France is opposed to the role played by Turkey and Qatar, but it's not because of the UAE that France is taking a specific role in Tunisia, and it so happens, because of this alliance of circumstances, that France did back most Ennahda opponents in the country, and that France is not seen as a particularly pro-political Islam or democratic transition in Tunisia.
Thanks so much, Youssef. That has been short and sweet, and I was expecting that from you. We don't have time for further questions. I'm really sorry for the people in the public who have asked questions, really interesting questions to the speakers. We will, of course, let the speakers know about the questions, so that they could see the reflection process, the thinking process. That's for sure. That's what these debates and these events are for as well. And now, sorry, apologies. Now, our friend Haizam Amirah-Fernández is going to wrap out his amazing session. He is a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute, an associate professor at the Instituto de Empresa. He has a BA from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid and an MA in Arab Studies on a Fulbright scholarship from Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He has lectured at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Georgetown University, San Luis University, Universidad San Pablo CEU, and the Universidad de Barcelona. He has also worked for the United Nations in New York and for Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C. Haizam, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Itxaso, and thanks a lot to Casa Árabe and to Fundación Alternativas for having me. I think it's been very interesting session and with great presentations looking into two regions in transformation, the Gulf and the Maghreb. It's very difficult to draw conclusions in 5 minutes, but I'll try to raise some points based on the presentations that we just listened to. So two regions in transformation and the need to adjust to new social, to new economic and political realities. Obviously, part of the transformation has to do with the changing dynamics in both inside certain countries and regional dynamics and the international system. All that combined with the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is still having and will continue to have on different parts of the world. And I think this is a factor that needs to be highlighted. You know, maybe if we have more time, I'm sure that in presentations that would have been more present. Also, the need to adjust to new realities. If I may be mistaken, but maybe then we haven't heard much about the U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Gulf, where the U.S. has played for decades the major role, foreign power, and you know, less so in the Maghreb, but also the last U.S. administration has had its impact. Both because of the methods, the way in which the Trump presidency or administration has functioned, allowing Gulf countries to jump in and fill some vacuums, extending their influence, projecting their power beyond their region, beyond the Gulf, but also the impact of the Trump administration in North Africa. And I think there's something very visible in the last minute decision by the Trump administration to basically announce a presidential proclamation recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara disputed territory. So the waves of revolts, and when talking about the need to adjust to new economic and social realities, people still talk about the Arab Spring, the 2011, you know, the first wave that produced transformations in certain Arab countries. In my opinion, it has not ended yet, if we consider it like a process that will be there for a long time because of the root causes that made people take to the streets and squares. Back in 2011, we saw it again in other countries in 2019. I think we're still in a period where, you know, those demonstrations of frustration, basically, you know, the need for new states and systems, we will continue to see the consequences of these new waves of Arab revolts after the health emergency ends in a way. Now, and that's Luciano Zaccara talked about the economic constraints in GCC countries because of issues of revenues, state revenues, etc. That is also happening in the Maghreb region. We're seeing it very clearly in the case of Tunisia, Morocco. We're seeing it also in Algeria, despite the differences in their economic structures and sources of revenues. We're seeing that these countries, for different reasons, have been hit hard due to different factors. The pandemic has exacerbated some of the factors that were already producing economic insecurity for a large number of people in these societies. So the question is, for how long will the effects of the health emergency continue to affect the countries both in the Maghreb and also in the Gulf, the Arab Gulf of GCC countries? And that combined with new dynamics, one of them being a new US administration, the Biden administration, and how it will deal with Gulf monarchies and strong men in the Gulf, I'm sure, we're already seeing there's a difference in the way of dealing or the family relations that existed under Trump and his son-in-law. And also how the Biden administration is going to deal with North Africa, with threat perceptions to the security, to the stability, working maybe closer with other allies, traditional allies of the US. That is something that under Trump was simply, US allies would learn about Trump decisions via Twitter. We're not going to see that anymore. At least for the coming 2 or 3 years or so, and also the idea of diversifying alliances, and this is something that was mentioned by Yasmina Abouzzohour, the diversification away from Europe. This is a trend that we're already seeing. I think in the next the closing remarks, in the next session, we will hear more from two people who know a lot about that. What's the role for the EU, which was traditionally the main partner in North Africa? That diversification combined with a more assertive foreign policy. In the case of Morocco, we're seeing it in the African continent, but also, the military spending. We've seen a period of an arms race between the two main Maghrebi countries, Algeria and Morocco. Well, they were spending lots of money in purchasing weapons. I think combined, they basically were they bought more weapons than the rest of the African continent combined for several years. So how all that together could lead to either a change in the choreography, be it towards more regional integration, which now seems far away. But remember, back in the late 80s, when the Arab Maghreb Union was established, that was because of difficulties that these countries were facing simultaneously, especially socioeconomic problems, bread riots, falling revenues by states, or whether all those tensions, and we're seeing the rhetoric, recently between the two main Maghrebi countries, in part as a result of Trump's decision in December 2020, the rhetoric has been more aggressive towards each other, more violent, if we can even call it that way, and whether that would lead to more, destabilization in the region, and what role for Gulf countries in all that. And I will finish by saying that also those economic constraints that Gulf countries are facing themselves as well, most likely will lead them to be less, to engage less in adventures, in foreign adventures, like the ones we saw over the past, especially 5-6 years, part of them as well taking place in North Africa, and to focus more, and I think this is something that Youssef Cherif was referring to, that will focus more on their internal affairs and maybe less, contributing less to the polarization taking place already in some of the North African countries and their political systems. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Haizam. That was amazing. You got to summarize and afterwards ask more questions for us to reflect about the next days, and sincerely grateful for that. Now, bear with us, dear participants and dear public. The technicians need to make a certain adjustments before the closing remarks. We are having with us two honorary speakers, and it's really going to be a true honor to have Ambassador James Moran and Yahya Zubir with us. So bear with us a few minutes, if you might, and we'll be back to you soon with more. Hello back, dear listeners and dear participants in this seminar. It has been amazing up until now. And nowadays we are going to have the closing remarks. As Haizam mentioned, they are going to hinge on what role for Europe or for the European Union in the Mediterranean. Although I have the feeling we will touch upon some of the aspects that all of the panelists have brilliantly spoke about throughout the two sessions. We have with us our first honorary speaker, Ambassador James Moran. He's an Associate Senior Research Fellow with the Center for European Policy Studies. He was Principal Advisor on the Middle East and North Africa at the EU's External Action Service in Brussels in 2016-2017. From 2012 to 2016, he was Ambassador and Head of the European Union Delegation in the Arab Republic of Egypt, where I had the honor of working with him for a short period of time. And he also headed the EU missions to Jordan and Yemen in 1999-2002. Ambassador Moran was also the EU senior coordinator in Libya during the 2011 uprising. His long service with the European institutions includes wide experience in European foreign, security, trade, and development policy in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Ambassador, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Casa, Árabe, and the Fundación for putting together such an interesting group of people with a great deal to say. I won't even try to touch too much on what has been said already, but there's a great deal of food for thought. In fact, so much food, it reminds me a little bit of one of the favorite dishes of the Maghreb, which I enjoy so much, which of course is couscous, and it's got that many ingredients. I just feel that we lack a chef to put it together in the way that a good Maghrebian chef would do it, and that we can enjoy the meal. It really is a situation which has become yet more complicated, yet more difficult as time has passed on. We've got all of the usual differences and splits over political Islam, the Brotherhood, Turkey's role in the region, which has of course been an irritant for many people for quite some time, not least in Europe as well. Now we have the Abraham Accords, so-called, the normalization agreements with Israel, which has led to more splits. Morocco, of course, signed one itself. Others have different views about this. And the list goes on. All of that accentuated by the continuing lack of economic integration, which one or two speakers have touched on in the course of the event today, and is an important backdrop to all of this, because without wishing to be too Eurocentric about the issue, as long as you don't have the economic glue to hold things together, you're bound to make things more difficult for yourself when it comes to things like security. And of course, you also have the continuing weakness of regional institutions. The poor old Arab League is as weak as it's ever been, and doesn't show too many signs of stepping up to the plate when it comes to any sort of regional security architecture going forward. This phrase, which has become current but has been around since 1948 in the region, we don't have that. So it's a little bit of a free-for-all, and with US retrenchment going on, and Fred Wery pointed that out very well earlier on, the prospect has got to be a little bit difficult when it comes to putting all of this together. Now, so far as Europe is concerned, let me just concentrate on that for the time being, if I may. Europe has not punched its weight in the region for quite some time. Internal divisions within the EU over Libya, difficulties of the transatlantic relationship during the Trump years, now slowly coming back into focus again with the new Biden administration. The difficulties over migration, where you've had very much concerning relationships with the Maghreb, where you've had different member states going off in different directions. Brexit hasn't helped either to hold things together. And again, it's a long list. I don't want to go on too much about that, but without wishing to be naive or wearing too much of a rose-tinted glasses and all of this, there might be one or two opportunities ahead for Europe to be a little bit more effective when it comes to the long-sought goals of security, stability, development in the region. Why do I say that? Well, I think the first thing is on Libya. Now, speakers have pointed to that, but it is important that I think for the first time in quite a long time, we find that two of the main players within Europe who have been quite split on this for a long time, Italy and France, seem to be tracking back to finding this on the same page when it comes to support for the new government of national unity and the UN plan. Now, there's an awful long way to go, and there are still 20,000 mercenaries in the country. Anything could go wrong. Having spent time on the ground myself in Libya, I do not underestimate the difficulties that lie ahead for this government, nor indeed for the international community. But I think there is something happening there, and this involves the Gulf states too. We heard earlier about the visit of Mr. Dbeibeh to the UAE and indeed to Saudi Arabia. This is important. It seems there too that there might be something happening to give a little hope now for the first time in many, many years that the Libyan irritant might just be moving slowly, glacially perhaps, towards some sort of solution. And the EU is now able, I think, which was not the case before, to play a much more effective role than it did in the past. Certainly, the reason why you've had so much Gulf involvement, and indeed the Russians, let's not get that either, in the Libyan imbroglio, has been the absence of the West, writ large, of course the United States, but also Europe. Europe's just not been there, except on humanitarian and some small developmental projects over the last few years. We really have not played much of a role there as Europe. And until and unless we do, I don't think that a Libyan solution is in the frame. But perhaps there is something happening. The second reason that I say there might be a prospect for a little bit more effective European foreign policy action has to do with the situation which is evolving in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, that involves primarily Libya and Egypt when it comes to the region, if you include Egypt as a brother of the Maghreb, as it were. But it is important because it also has Turkey on the list as well. Turkey relations, very important. It is just conceivable there that the EU might be able to push forward. And I see that in the EU policy paper on the southern neighborhood, which was issued a couple of months ago, there is a call for a conference on the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, conferences of themselves don't solve anything, but it's the first time that you've seen the EU take an initiative on this incredibly difficult, complicated, and dangerous situation evolving in the Eastern Mediterranean, which involves the Maghreb, involves the Gulf, and involves European interests themselves. So I think the other point that the policy paper makes, there are many things to talk about in that, is this issue of nearshoring. And here we come on to the economy. Be very interested to see what the professor has to say about this too. Europe has become, many people feel, a bit too dependent on East Asia for its value change. Now, you know, of course, there is this move to try to do more when it comes to involving North Africa and the Middle East, particularly North Africa, in European value chains. And I think there is some prospect there. There may even be prospect for some collaboration with the Gulf. For a long, long time, when I was in Egypt, I remember these conversations going on. We were talking about joint developmental financing with the Gulf institutions. It never really came to much. The banks, the development banks, the European Investment Bank, on the one hand, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Kuwaiti funds and so on, had very different ways of operating. It's very hard, given the very different administrative cultures and indeed governance of these institutions, to bring them together. But it was always thought that there could be some interesting possibilities there for spurring investment in North Africa, which of course is desperately needed. But, and here is my last point, whatever the EU does or does not do in terms of contributing to stability in the region in the next year or so, it's very important to remember that there is one issue which is not in the region, which is paramount for EU policy makers. Excuse me, 1 second, I have to close the door. I have a rather playful cat here who is not leaving me alone. But this issue, of course, is Iran. It is often cited as Europe's greatest foreign policy achievement, that it contributed along with others, of course, to the JCPOA. Now there's a chance of bringing it back into being. Like the US, we heard this from Fred earlier, like the US, this is an exclusive priority for European foreign policy. And I think that that means that Europe will need very much to keep the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, of course, on side, working together with the US and others in taking forward the debate on Iran. And this also means that in terms of being too confrontational over some of the issues like spoilers in Libya, UAE financing of mercenaries, or indeed the Gulf role in supporting Morocco's claimed sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is difficult for a number of European member states, given the UN Charter. This is not something which I think Europe is going to take to the limit. Whatever it takes, using now Prime Minister Mario Draghi's famous phrase, whatever it takes to get that Iran deal back online is going to be the number one and exclusive priority in the near term for European foreign policy. So one should not forget it and not have any illusions about Europe becoming too active in terms of contributing to overall security in the Maghreb. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for all of your participants and speakers. I learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador James Moran, speaking from Brussels, from the heart of Europe, also undergoing very, very tough restrictions due to COVID-19. Of course, this last section is dedicated to that role that the EU can or wants to play in the region, in balancing probably this these two poles, the Gulf and the Maghreb, that we have been discussing for the past 2 hours and a half. The issue of Iran is indeed key, as you mentioned. We have barely touched upon the Abraham Accords for some reason. And it is true that there may be some spoilers for this JCPOA reactivation. And we literally on the news were hearing of this attack on the nuclear facilities in Natanz, and that the Mossad might be allegedly involved in it, or at least they haven't denied their participation. So there might be other spoilers for the Iran-EU rapprochement, and definitely a challenge for European diplomats. Let's move on to our last but not least speaker, and maybe in that sense he is the chef that Ambassador Moran was pointing towards as the chef who will finally make this couscous be able to be enjoyable for all of us. Yahya Zubair is professor of international relations and international management and director of research in geopolitics at Kedge Business School. He has been international visiting faculty in numerous universities and business schools for the last 30 years in China, the United States, various European and Asian countries. He has published dozens of scholarly works, including books, articles, entries in encyclopedias and book chapters on international politics, foreign policy, governance, and security issues. He has served as consultant for governments and companies worldwide. In 2020, he was visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center in Qatar. Thank you very much, Yahya, for joining us from Marseille. And you have also your 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you, Casa Árabe, for hosting me. I find it a little bit difficult to talk after so many panelists, but I think I have a few things to contribute. One of the, about many years ago, I had written a piece on the impact of the Gulf War on the Maghreb. And I tried to analyze at that time the reactions of the people of the Maghreb vis-a-vis the Gulf countries. What transpired from that study is that the Maghrebis, at that time I did only the three, the central Maghreb, that is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And what appeared was the attitudes of the populations in the region towards the Gulf. It was mostly negative in the sense that though they had condemned the invasion of Kuwait, but at the same time, they were not very pleased with the Gulf Arabs. This was in the 1990s, the early 1990s. And my question today would be, since we have been talking only about the states, we haven't talked about the people. What is it that the people of the Maghreb think about the Gulf? What are the issues that are most important to the people of the Maghreb as far as the region, the Gulf region is concerned? The Maghrebis are, mostly concerned about the Palestinian issue. That is probably in the top of their priorities. We have seen it's true. Many of the speakers have talked about the money that the Gulf Arabs have brought, mostly to Morocco, not to Tunisia. And if I look from a geopolitical perspective, not much has changed since the 1970s. The Gulf Arabs supported Morocco in the occupation of Western Sahara. That is nothing new. The Saudis were pumping money during that time with the blessing of France. And today is probably, is obviously the same scenario taking place. And so, and this is creating a very big problem. I would talk about the Abraham Accords, since you said there wasn't enough. I think you are right, because we have not calculated the implications of what has happened, especially for Algeria, which now feels encircled like it did in the 1970s, which means that it will antagonize, this situation will poison relations between France and Algeria, which is happening, by the way, including the announcement by the La République en Marche, opening an office in Dakhla, against international law and what have you. So this is a very bad issue. Again, what will happen, my scenario, if the Algerians feel pushed too hard, you will see more of a presence of Russia and China in the region. In other words, a recomposition of alliances. Algeria tends to be non-aligned, avoiding any any preference for it takes weapons from Russia, its traditional supplier, it's doing infrastructure with the Chinese, good relations, even anti-terrorism with the United States. But the Abraham Accords may undo or transform the attitudes in the region. And there are a few things that I would like to mention that the GCC, I'm not talking about who is right or who's wrong within the GCC in terms of the conflict, but the conflict spilled over into Libya. We have seen it in terms of, the UAE siding with the East, Qatar siding with the, Qatar siding with the West, and the UAE with the East, with the support of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And that is also a problem from, we have not talked about it, from a regional perspective. Algerians are very annoyed by that presence, even of Turkey, by the way. And so are the Tunisians in many ways, because it adds to the problems already existing in the area. When I raise the issue of the people and how they feel, you have to look at the pictures of when the marches took place in Algeria in 2019, and they had, billboards with UAE stay out and so on and so forth. That is, that the Gulf were not, are perceived as troublemakers in the region. And there's an overlap, if you wish, with the governments or with the states, particularly Algeria and Tunisia. And so that's as far as the Iraq is concerned, which was, in my view, sort of taking the temperature of the views of the people towards the Gulf, including, the Moroccans with this Abraham Accords. We don't know yet what the Moroccan people themselves, who are pro-Palestinian, what they feel, or how can they express their real feelings about that accord, that happened after December 10th. So that is a big issue, and I think it's going to bring more problems. One thing that has not been mentioned, if I may just throw it at the audience, is the Sahel. In terms of security, the Sahel is connected to the Maghreb, and the Saudis and the Emiratis have pledged and have done, given money to the G5, and so the perception from the region, depending on where with whom you side, obviously, but it bodes well. I mean, it doesn't bode well for the reason as such, because now they see all these interferences within the region as bringing more problems, creating problems between Europe and so on. And by the way, this notion that somehow the Gulf, the GCC is bringing a lot of wealth in the region. Again, I think, and I hope that Ambassador Moran would agree with me, Europe is still the main player. You have to look at the trade statistics to know that whoever is in the region does not, match, the trade relations and the traditional ties. What the Maghrebi states are doing, all of them, whatever their nature, are trying to get some sort of autonomy, because none of them has succeeded in breaking the dependency in which they have been tied in the post-colonial era. So it gave them some freedom. If you look even to Morocco, it was in 2016 that the King Mohammed VI, made a famous speech where he said, we have to diversify, and turned a little bit to China. But trade with China, which is favorable to China, by the way, amounts to $4.6 billion only. It's not, it's not groundbreaking. Whereas the EU with Morocco, total volume would probably is around $50 billion. So there is no commensurate measure. What I'm trying to say is very simple, is that the presence or the involvement of the Gulf countries has not been all that positive. I mentioned Libya, okay? In Algeria, you have the problem, and I think Tunisia, I don't know if Youssef talked about it, the Medkhalist. That was also one of the brand of Islam that was brought to the region. The Maghreb is Maliki right. It is not Wahhabi right. It is not. It is a problem in the region, and so it creates tensions socially. So it's a real problem. And this problem with the Western Sahara, if the Europeans and the United States does not come together to try to find a solution, a serious solution, rather than allowing the conflict to drag on like it has for the last 30 years. I think it's a big problem. I was attending a seminar earlier today at Tiremam here in Paris, in Aix-en-Provence, and the arguments are the same. And these are scholars, obviously, and they blame France, and France is in cahoots with the Emiratis, and this is a real problem for the region. I think that Europe, since I take advantage of the presence of Ambassador Moran, to say, you know, the Europeans have to wake up and smell the coffee, because that problem is not going to disappear overnight. You're not going to say, okay, you have the Abraham Accords, I recognize your sovereignty over a territory that you have occupied that is still at the United Nations, at the United Nations Security Council and so on, or the European, the Court of Justice of the European Union. They have has recognized the sovereignty of Morocco over the territory. So it's a problem. It's a time bomb, and of course it's going to result in more arms race. And of course, somebody had mentioned here who is supplying or who is spending most of the money, more than Africa together, and this this circulation of weapons, will end up being used. So I think that the level-headed people have to look into the area. And now, since you have talked about COVID-19 and so on, the problems are boiling. There are people I faced with Ramadan tomorrow. You're going to see that the purchasing power of the populations has gone down. The socioeconomic situations are not so good. So if you add a geopolitical problem and a conflict, it may get into an armed conflict again. And if it breaks out, I think it would not bode well for the region. These are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Bravo.
That has been amazing, Professor Sudhir. Thanks also Ambassador Moran. It has been an honor. Thanks so much to all the panelists. I could stay here for hours and even days, but I don't think that's the case for everybody. So thanks so much for the insights. I think for the food for thought and maybe for the material for new events, as you said, it is so important to speak about the public opinion and about the societies themselves. So maybe that should be a motivation for us to focus away from geopolitics and on the peoples, which are the ones who we should be caring about. Thanks for reminding us of that. And I'm going to leave Karim to close, to wind up the event. Thanks so much to all the participants, the ones who've left, the ones who are still with us, and please take care, and Ramadan Kareem, of course, as it's starting tomorrow. And again, it has been a huge honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Itxaso, and thank you to both Yahya Zubair and Ambassador James Moran for those concluding remarks. I think they were extremely insightful. Indeed, what the people want was, in the end, what actually sparkled, were the sparkle behind those Arab uprisings, and those were turning points not only for the people of the region, but for the reactions of the states that we have been talking about for the past 3 hours almost. So it is very important to keep that in mind. As Itxaso was suggesting, maybe we should design another seminar a bit more focused also on that dimension that I think is hugely important. Feeling cornered is never a good thing, and a state such as Algeria, as Yahya was pointing out, is we have actually been doing some conferences here at Casa Árabe somehow to keep an eye on Algeria and also on the Sahel, which is a region that is extremely important for Europe, but also for the Maghreb, for the north of Africa. Let's say those issues of borders that are very porous and that bring about extremely volatile situations for many of the states that we have been talking about, Tunisia being one of them, of course Algeria, and indeed the issue of the Western Sahara that we are always touching upon slightly, and that is very often difficult to pin down, especially from Spain. Of course, a word to thank everyone that has taken part in this marathon, in this event, in this webinar. To those of us, all of you who have been listening across, the event will be still available online if you want to check on it at different times after this is over. And maybe a comment on the title that we chose for this seminar, the Gulf and the Maghreb in Uncertain Times. I think these times are, in a way, to paraphrase Zygmunt Bauman and his concept of liquid modernity, that constant change, that fragility, that vulnerability that permeates or affects all of our infrastructures these days and our social contracts. We are witnessing changes, major changes that are happening at such a rapid pace that the individuals and societies and their behaviors cannot react fast enough to what these changes are in the end bringing about. No, it's very challenging, and so also to paraphrase one of those journals, newspapers that are printed in a slightly pink color. We live in uncertain times. Thank you very much for everyone, and make sure you follow each other's works, and we are more than pleased to host you, both Fundación Alternativas and Casa Árabe. We will be watching very closely the events that are unfolding soon, elections, the end of the year in Libya, precisely, that we've been talking so much about Libya and the Beiba government. We expect to see also some changes there. Algeria, of course, also before that, and the future of the Iraq movement. So thank you everyone again, and we were very pleased to have you all on board on this occasion. Till the next time, and Ramadan Kareem, and a la prochaine. Hasta luego.